Conducting my research, I interviewed 3 people about an experience we all had high on the mountain, and none of us could agree on such crucial facts as who was there, what had been said, or what time it was. The staggering unreliability of the human mind at high altitude made the research problematic. As we climb, we are surrounded by death. We'll notice it at first. It might frighten us. It might make us sick. It might make us wonder why the hell it was we wanted to put ourselves in this situation in the first place. But quickly, it will all fade into the peripheries. It will be as though there is an unspoken agreement on the mountain that these desiccated remains aren't real. We'll just walk right over them. None of us will dare acknowledge what's truly at stake here. Welcome to base camp. This is where we orient you, get you ready to climb, and ultimately we prepare you for death. Over here is Everest. 1 in 13 people that climb it will die. Over here is Annapurna. 1 in 3 people who climb it will die. Now, those numbers are actually a little bit skewed because they take into consideration all the people that start to climb it and then have the good sense to turn back around before something awful happens. If those people had continued on, or if we just backed them out altogether, the numbers would probably be closer to 1 in 7 on Everest, and you might have a 50-50 shot on Annapurna. Now, this third mountain, the one that I'm currently climbing, is the Academy. None of that ivory tower crap. If ever such a magical, mystical place existed, it burnt down some time ago. Nothing here but the sheer gray and white cliffs. Now, when I talk about death over there or over there, I'm talking about the literal death, shuffling off this mortal coil, or side of the mountain, as it were. When I talk about that here, I mean it figuratively. Like, you know the feeling on like a Friday evening when you're driving home from work and all you want to do is like have a beer and maybe some food, but then you remember that you don't have any beer at home or any food, so then you have to like sit in traffic longer. You go to the supermarket and you get to the supermarket and everyone else didn't have beer or food at home, so they're all waiting in line and you have to wait in line, and it just feels like purgatory, right? That's kind of what it feels like here, except forever, or at least until you actually die. When I talk about death here, and don't worry, I'm not going to talk about it too much. I think literal death on literal mountains is probably more exciting than figurative death on the figurative mountains. But here I just mean that it's living a life towards death. And the numbers are actually closer to Annapurna than they are to Everest. 1 in 3 PhDs will struggle up the mountain and never make it back down. For this next part, I'm going to need a little help. Can I get the house lights on? Thanks. Emily, would you mind helping? Thanks. I just need to set this up so if you can find the ladder, I'll hand it up and then you'll tie it off. It's stable. More of us. So here, just tie these off on the side. Got it?
Yes, so.
Okay. While you're doing that, a little bit of history. The first people to actually stand on top of Mount Everest were Edmund Hillary, a New Zealander, and Tenzing Norgay, a Nepalese Sherpa. Now, Sherpas live in the communities around Mount Everest in the Himalayas, and over the years, as more and more people have wanted to climb, more and more have these Sherpa communities been affected by those wanting to stand at the top of the world. Now, Sherpas are hired out to do the really treacherous work on the mountains. They act as guides, they carry others' equipment, they build if you make it up that high, you can count yourself lucky that you haven't fallen into a crevasse or succumbed to high altitude cardiac edema or pulmonary edema or been swept off the side of a mountain by an avalanche or succumbed to the myriad of ways that you could possibly get bodily harm on the mountain. If you make it that high, chances are when you get there, there will be a Sherpa waiting for you. Someone who has gone through the exact same thing that you have, and they will have set up your tent for you, and they will greet you with a hot cup of green tea. The first person who died on Mount Everest was a Sherpa, and 80 of the 239 people that have died since have been Sherpas. Anything else said? Okay, thanks. Come down. Sorry. This is Emily. She was a grad student here. She's now an instructor, and she's just awesome. So give her a round of applause. Now, for I guess about 30 years before Tenzing Norgay Sherpa and Sir Edmund Hillary made it to the top of Mount Everest, other people had been trying and failing to make it to the top. My favorite story is the story of a guy named Maurice Wilson. Maurice Wilson was British, and he woke up one day. He lived in like northern England, and he woke up one day with no mountaineering skills and no flying ability, but with the express desire to fly a plane into the side, crash it into the side of Mount Everest, and then wherever he happened to get, climb up from there. He wanted to be the first person to make it to the top. So he set about acquiring these skills. He got a pilot's license, barely passing his pilot exam, but he passed. And then he trained for the perils of climbing in the Himalayas by hiking through the Welsh countryside. This is kind of the equivalent of climbing up and down the Indian Mountains on campus a couple of times, or maybe up and down the levee. But he did this, and he figured now he's ready to climb the great Mount Everest. And so he set off, and miraculously he actually made it all the way to Cairo, Egypt, without any problem. And he landed there at a British outpost, and when he got there, the British officials were kind of taken aback by this guy. They're like, what the hell do you think you're doing? Because up until that point, and continuing from that point, British climbing involved what they called laying siege to the mountain, right? So it wasn't just one or two people climbing. It was about 100 people setting up camps and building and going in groups 2 by 2 to get to the top. So Tenzing Norgay and Hillary, the first to make it, they were just the last pair in this collective ladder of 2 by 2 getting to the top. So they had over 100 other people helping them. So the idea that this one guy was going to fly a plane into the side of the mountain and climb up from there, they didn't really fly with the British officials. So they told him that he had to get back in his plane and head straight back to England. So he got back in his plane, took off, and continued on towards Nepal. He landed in northern India, again at a British outpost, and at that point the British officials had been warned that this guy might show up. And so instead of saying you need to go back to England, they simply confiscated his plane. Not to be deterred, Maurice Wilson continued on foot, and he hiked into Nepal, illegally crossing the border there. And then he found 2 Sherpas who would be willing to try to climb to the top with him. And they actually made it to 22,700 feet. At that point, the highest that anyone had made it on Everest. But by the time they got there, the 2 Sherpas had to admit defeat. They figured with the altitude and the weather was awful, they knew that they weren't going to be able to make it. And they begged Maurice Wilson to come back with them. But he was adamant. He was going to make it to the top. So the Sherpas returned down, and Maurice Wilson tried to continue on. A few years later, Maurice Wilson's body was found at around 22,700 feet. And on his body was his journal. And the last entry in the journal simply read, "Off again, gorgeous day." You don't need a reason to climb Mount Everest, or any mountain for that matter. In fact, you're probably better off without a reason. Here is a story of some Nepalese rats. Now, the story goes that at one point, Nepal was facing an incredible drought. There was no food for anyone. It Nepalese rats meet a group of rats from Tibet. And the Tibetan rats say that they are headed to Nepal, where they heard there was food because there's no food in Tibet. And then the Nepalese rats say, oh, we were headed to Tibet because there's no food in Nepal. Well, realizing the situation, the rats decided that rather than starve to death, they would give themselves to Chomolungma, the mother goddess of mountains. So, one rat threw himself from the peaks and cried out,